This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Welcome to the seminar. Happy New Year to everyone. It's great to see so many people here. And a really warm welcome to Annabelle Wilkins, who's our speaker tonight. Annabelle is in the very final stages of her PhD, submitting very soon, which is fantastic. And Annabelle's PhD is on home, work in the city for Vietnamese people in East London. So thinking about home in relation to work, city, migration, and doing really fascinating research, interviews and visual research. So I'm out of breath coming up those stairs. It's terrible. And it's an AHLC CDA studentship in collaboration between Queen Mary and the Jeffrey Museum of the Home, based at the Centre for Studies of Home, part of the broader homework programme, which had 4 PhD studentships in it. Annabelle's also doing really interesting collaborative work. She's had funding from the Centre for Public Engagement at Queen Mary to develop work with the composer Edward Nesbitt with some of her Vietnamese participants in the research, which is great. So lots of really interesting new collaborations and outreach and engagement work. Annabelle's talking tonight about connecting worlds, intersections between spatial, temporal, material and spiritual realms within Vietnamese homes in East London. And if you could all sign the book that's going around. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you everyone for coming. My research examines the complex multi-scalar relationships between home, work and migration among Vietnamese people in East London. Rather than considering these themes in terms of 3 distinct categories of migrant experience, the study explores the multiple connections between them, identifying the ways in which individual participants navigate and negotiate these relationships. It considers work to include both domestic and economic activity within and beyond the home, examining how different forms of work are related to homemaking practices and how home and work are reconfigured or transformed by mobility. Drawing upon in-depth personal narratives alongside material and visual dimensions of home, work and urban mobility, I argue that participants not only inhabit or work in the city, but also reshape it, contributing to its ongoing transformation through their everyday practices and movements around the city. My research begins from the concept of home as a spatial, embodied, imagined and symbolic site and process that is experienced at multiple scales, including within a dwelling in relation to neighbourhoods, cities and across transnational space. A growing body of research explores how home is reconfigured by and within mobility. This work not only explores the ways that migrants maintain or recreate a sense of home in a new place, but also provokes broader questions about what home is and where and when it might be located. My research also builds upon the recognition that migrants' everyday lives are local and emplaced as well as transnational, and draws upon recent work by Alison Blunt, among others, upon ideas of the city as home among diasporic communities. Whilst it's increasingly accepted that home cannot be separated from wider structures of power, recent scholarship calls for in-depth engagement with geopolitical dimensions of home. Such research recognises that home may be experienced as a place of exclusion rather than one of belonging, particularly among migrants, refugees and other marginalised groups. My research contributes to this literature by examining how immigration policies, work and housing conditions influence migrants' capacities to create a home and the extent to which they can develop a sense of belonging in the city. East London has a long history as a site of migration, settlement and cultural diversity and has been widely studied in academic research and popular discourse. In contrast to the large body of work on migration to East London among a diverse range of populations, Vietnamese communities in London have received little scholarly attention. In focusing on Vietnamese migrants in East London, however, my research does not seek to prioritise the significance of ethnicity, neither do I assume that the Vietnamese necessarily constitute a community in an unproblematic sense. Instead, my research situates Vietnamese migrants within the increasing superdiversity that characterises East London and the city as a whole. This paper takes relationships between the spatial, temporal and spiritual dimensions of home as its main focus. After a brief discussion of the methodological approach adopted to study connections between home, work and urban mobility, I begin with participants' descriptions and memories of their homes in Vietnam, noting the multiple ways in which different forms of work are interwoven with urban dwelling. I then examine the ways in which ideas and practices of home are reconfigured in the context of migration and how participants navigate the challenges of remaking home in the city. My research combines a focus on the individual narratives of first-generation migrants, all of whom were born in Vietnam and have migrated over a range of time periods from the end of the Vietnam War to the present day. My methods involved repeat semi-structured interviews and visual methods, including photography of participants' homes and objects within them. While the majority of interviews were conducted within people's homes, others were conducted at participants' workplaces, which were also home for some individuals, and in public spaces depending on people's housing and work situations and preferences. This focus on multiple sites has also enabled my research to explore the dynamic relationships between home, work and the city in context of mobility. Research on home raises numerous methodological questions, including how to analyse spaces and practices that are routine, taken for granted or hidden. Researchers have used combinations of life history interviews, visual methods and studies of domestic objects and interiors to explore ideas, meanings and sensory memories of home in the context of diaspora. Material culture scholars note that objects and images can trigger feelings and memories of home that can also be evoked or reproduced in new places. Svasek notes that photographs should be understood as multisensory objects that can evoke multiple emotions and memories. For example, when migrant worshippers visit a temple in their new environment, they experience not only the sight of religious images, but also the smell of incense and sounds of prayer, chanting or singing. The meanings of objects or images may also be transformed in processes of mobility. Discussing the significance of photographs of the Dalai Lama among members of the exiled Tibetan diaspora, Harris notes that these images do not only evoke religious feelings among Tibetan migrant communities, but are also drawn upon to generate a sense of solidarity and resistance against Chinese politics. Parrott proposes that people's relationships with their objects can reveal how their lives are reshaped by migration. She notes that objects may have uncontrolled emotional effects, describing how things that were intended to bring a sense of comfort may actually evoke feelings of loss or isolation in a new location. Drawing upon these perspectives, my research explores the material, sensory and emotional dimensions of domestic objects and images and how they relate to the wider world. Participants were invited as part of their interviews to share an object that was significant to them in terms of their past or present homes or forms of work. Individuals shared a diverse range of objects and images, including some which were brought from Vietnam and were centred on memories of particular homes, places or times, and others which were linked with practices of homemaking in their new location. I should say here that there's not really time to go into the ethical considerations that were raised by my research, but I do so in my thesis and I'm happy to take questions at the end. Good. Relationships between home, work and the city in Vietnam are highly visible in the structure of the urban house, which often takes the form of a small business on the ground floor with sleeping and living accommodation above. Several participants discussed how their parents undertook paid work from their homes, including in the form of restaurants and cafes, running their own businesses or subletting part of the ground floor to other entrepreneurs. T lived with his mother, grandparents and 2 siblings in Ho Chi Minh City before coming to London to begin his studies. Is that? I didn't mean to do that. Is it timed?
Can you push the arrows? Can you? Yeah. I'm sure you can override it.
In T's description of his house, it is clear that home, work and the wider world are closely interwoven. He says, "My house has got 2 doors. The front area, my mum rents out to a travel agent to Cambodia, and by the back door she runs an internet cafe, and normally I have to help her to be a shopkeeper. We live on the mezzanine, on the middle floor." When asked to describe their houses, several participants began with a description of the house as it would appear from above. Recalling return visits to the country that he left as a refugee, Son described his view over the city as the plane came into land. "The houses in Vietnam are a little bit funny, because I remember every time we went back, when the aeroplane goes down and you look, the houses always look like boxes. The more money you have, you build another level, so we started with 1 and we only had 2, but it's quite tall as well." Son's narrative moves on to describe his childhood home in vivid detail. He recalled the layout of the interior of his house, noting which spaces were used for work-related activities such as raising animals and running a business, and parts of the house which were designated as living and sleeping areas, and the dedication of the top floor to worshipping the ancestors. He says, "When we come to the front entrance, we have the business, the cafe in front, and at the back, there's a well in the middle of the house, and at the back we have a big backyard, that's where we have the pigs. The bedrooms upstairs, over here, we probably have 1 bedroom downstairs, 1 upstairs, and we have a flat roof. The top floor they always tend to use for altars, for praying, because of the incense, the fire starts and they just burn it on the top floor. The middle part's used for sleeping and for doing business or everyday activities on the ground floor. Nguyen Lu left her home in Vietnam at the age of 5, but vividly remembers her grandmother's house in Saigon, which she described as beautiful. This home was also a place of work, as her grandmother ran a restaurant business on the ground floor. She said, well, there was about 5 or 6 stories, and my grandmother had a restaurant downstairs where she would make noodle soup for breakfast, so people would come there to buy it. My uncle got up every morning at 3 to prepare everything, and she would sell it. Home and work are intertwined in Nguyen's memories of this house. Her grandmother's noodle soup was made from a recipe originating in her hometown of Hue in central Vietnam. As she described the house, Nguyen noted her grandmother's resourcefulness in offering a dish that was popular and difficult to obtain in the city, which enabled her family to survive during the harsh conditions of the war. Hien, who left Vietnam to study in London, also noted the distinctiveness of Vietnamese houses from above. During our interview, she shared this photograph of Hanoi that she took shortly before she left the city to study in London. As she described her photograph, she highlighted the diversity and verticality of architecture in contemporary Hanoi, also describing how the city has changed over time. She said, well, you see the really old houses with the old style roofs, and here you see it's a little more modern, and this is like a real concrete modern building. So, I think it is developing, but something about the old quarter in Hanoi is that people don't just destroy a house and build a new one, they just try to keep it like that and then build up. So if you see houses in Hanoi, you see this pipe house, like it's very narrow, it goes up, so each floor is sometimes just the size of this room, and they build it sometimes 5, 6, 7, 9 floors. The narrow streets of the old quarter are characterised by the pipe or tube houses that Hien describes in her narrative, buildings which contain workshops or businesses as well as living accommodation. As she described her photograph, Hien compared her view of Hanoi with cities that she'd visited outside of Vietnam. She refers to the multiplicity of different forms of architecture and its connection with the city's identity. She said, I think it's so Vietnamese. Like in the West, when I stay in a rooftop place for coffee and I look down, the view is not like this, Here you see the roofs are so different colours, different styles, different heights. And something very special about Vietnam is because of the time the French and Americans, different countries, influenced the architecture of this country. The materiality of housing in Vietnam is intertwined with Vietnamese concepts of the family, which also includes deceased relatives. Ancestor worship is part of a system of belief in which spirits of the deceased are considered to exist alongside the living and are regarded as having power over their lives. Practices of ancestor worship are not only embedded in Vietnamese cultural tradition, but are also apparent in the architecture and material culture of the Vietnamese home. Among more affluent families, the highest part of the house is dedicated to the ancestral altar, which often consists of pictures of the deceased relatives, candles, incense, offerings of fruit and flowers. However, most residents of cities live in densely populated conditions and living space must be shared. T points out a contrast between Vietnamese living space and that of houses he's encountered in the West, as he describes how he slept alongside both living relatives and ancestors. He says, we don't really have the idea of bedrooms. Only my mum's got her own room, which happens to have a bed inside that, but we don't call it a bedroom, we say mum's room. I don't have a room, I sleep in the living room. Actually, I sleep under the altar. T's narrative also links the interior of Vietnamese homes with the kinship structure of the family in which 3 generations live together under one roof. He describes how this extended family model enables relatives to share the care of younger and older members. He says, it's quite common because we've got a close family relationship. Your mum can be with you until after you're 18. When I came here, a lot of people, their kid is just after 18 and they become independent. But in my country, they say that we grow a baby until they're 18 years old. That reflects the strong bond between family members. We don't have the idea of a nursing home like here. That's why we say the family in Vietnam is really more like a 3-generation family than a nuclear family. Grandfather, mum, dad, and the kids. When mum and dad go to work, the grandfather can stay home to get the kids and things like that. We call it self-support each other. That's why the family bond is, I'd say, closer than in the West. I think so. And several of my participants referred to the idea of a collectivist family, a system of values that emphasises a close bond between family members, respect for parents and ancestors. Shared living space is associated with the care and well-being of the family as a whole, and is not only viewed as a result of the economic and spatial constraints of urban life. Relationships between the Vietnamese home and the wider world become particularly apparent during Tet. the Lunar New Year festival, which is seen as a time to renew social bonds and prepare for the coming year. Drawing on Heidegger's theory of dwelling, Tim Ingold proposes that the world continually comes into being around the inhabitant. McAllister applies this perspective to the Vietnamese home, studying the ways in which the home becomes meaningful through the experiences of those who live there. Many of the rituals involved in Tet take place within the home, including the cleansing and renewing of the home and domestic altar as families prepare to welcome living and dead relatives. These activities link the home to other sites in the city, including markets, shops and pagodas. It is this connection and movement that leads McAllister to describe the home using Foucault's concept of heterotopia, a place that connects to other sites through the activities of its inhabitants. He proposes that the home connects to the heavens, to an ancestral graveyard, to the ancestors in the underworld or in heaven, to pagodas or churches and other sites associated with the supernatural in various ways, spatially, temporally, materially, and spiritually. In addition to concepts of home that centre on the family, meanings of home in Vietnam are also identified in relation to the native or original homeland, which is translated as Quê Hương, the ancestral home that's associated with birth and childhood. During and after the Vietnam conflict, millions of Vietnamese people moved from the communist-ruled north to the wealthier south of the country. Despite having been born in a city, several of my participants referred to their hometown as the place where their grandparents were born. Internal migration is a prominent factor in the contemporary Vietnamese economy, including through seasonal agriculture and domestic work. These movements are part of how Vietnam is constructed as a nation and also influence people's ideas of home. And here, Son, who left as a refugee, discussed his perception of home for those who have experienced forced migration. He said, maybe if you're local Vietnamese, if you live in the country, let's say where I'm from, in the middle of the country, if I go down south to work and I go home for Lunar New Year, then yes, that would be considered as home to visit my parents, my ancestors, whatever, you would call it that. But because us boat people, we've been away so long, we don't say that is home anymore. We say we go home to visit family, but we call the UK home now. We settle, we feel safer coming back to the UK than we say we go back home, back to Vietnam. The Vietnamese word for home, nhà, can also refer to house, family, wife, and nation. These simultaneous meanings highlight the multiscalarity of home within Vietnam and are closely associated with ideas of the household and the positions of men and women in Vietnamese society. These roles can also be observed within the Vietnamese proverb, men build the house, women build the home. In a study of the ways in which spoken utterances provoke spatial imaginings, Catherine Brickell discusses the multiple gendered meanings of home that are contained within this proverb. She says, in the proverb, nhà means simultaneously house, home and family, thus rendering men responsible not only for the physical construction of the house, but also as guardians for ensuring the success of one's family, marriage and wider ancestry. Meanwhile, to'am, meaning nest, suggests that women also have a key role in reproducing their husband's lineage through devotion to creating a warm and loving home life, and not necessarily to its manual building. Vietnamese concepts of home are influenced by Confucianist principles of hierarchy and filial piety, within which men's identities are related to their patriarchal role in the family. Women's actions have traditionally been defined as revolving around the home, and both family and public life are strongly male-oriented. Although women in contemporary Vietnam are also active in work outside the home, images of women as guardians of traditional culture continue to associate them with the domestic and the so-called inner realm of the home. Hang described her mother's world as being centred on the home. She remembered her mother washing their clothes in a metal tub on the ground floor of the house, where she enjoyed talking to neighbours as they passed by. Later, her mother made extra money by selling homemade food on the street outside the house. Hang's narrative emphasises the ways in which gendered roles have been transmitted through multiple generations of her family. She said, it's the traditional thing. My mum cooks, she washes the dishes. I mean, she didn't want me to help because she wanted me to study, and that's it. My grandmother lives in the countryside, and yeah, I think she was still doing all the housework, and my grandfather was doing some commercial work in another province. And also now my uncle, who's my mum's younger brother, he doesn't do housework either, it's more his wife. And I found throughout the interviews that these ideas of women as having to sacrifice their needs for others were still prevalent or in Vietnamese popular media, so people are still affected by those ideas. So even if they have career aspirations, often those are cut short because they're expected to go back home and marry someone and settle down. So I think there's a bit of tension between the modern and traditional ideas. Researchers note that home may refer to both a lived space and to a space of felt or imagined belonging. For migrants and people in contexts of mobility, these aspects of home may not be located in the same place. Responding to these concerns, my research considers the multiple definitions of home that participants express in their narratives, including the material, emotional, and imaginative. Relationships between home, work, and the city in this research are complex, reflecting the economic challenges of living in London and the mobility and change that characterise contemporary work and home lives. Most participants were prepared to travel significant distances across London for work opportunities, although the majority lived in the areas of Hackney, Stratford, and Mile End. These locations are also convenient for people who work in Vietnamese restaurants, most of which are located in the Shoreditch and other areas of Hackney. Other participants undertake various forms of paid work from home, including freelance interpreting and Vietnamese teaching. These forms of work are influenced by their housing, immigration status, and the availability of employment. And many people combined things like studying with teaching from home and working in a nail salon or restaurant, finding as many ways as possible to supplement their income. Whilst many participants who came as refugees initially lived in overcrowded, substandard conditions, many of them were subsequently allocated housing by local councils and housing associations, which contributed to the establishment of Vietnamese communities in particular areas. For participants who've migrated to London in the last 10 years, private sector renting is usually the only viable option for living in the capital. The places and strategies through which students find accommodation in London can also be understood as points of connection between different generations of Vietnamese people with diverse migration circumstances. So Min described how she learned about the existence of Vietnamese communities in London when her sister sent her details of the house that they would be renting in Hackney, and this was when she was still in Vietnam. This house was being let by a Vietnamese person who had originally arrived in London as a refugee. Several other participants had secured housing through personal contacts and online networks and had informal rental agreements with their landlords. Participants' housing choices, I would argue, are not only related to economic factors nor directly linked to the location of their employment and education, but are intertwined with their motivations to create a sense of belonging and familiarity in London. Most participants who live in rented accommodation move at least once or twice a year, with some having moved twice within a 6-month period, and many of them had moved several times within the period of my contact with them, and sometimes between interviews. Several participants described feeling unmotivated to furnish or decorate their house with objects that may soon have to be moved out again, presenting a barrier to developing a sense of home. Phung, who shared her room with another Vietnamese student, described how she had to thoroughly clean her room just to make it habitable. She said, "I haven't really changed anything, just rearranged things in the room, you know. When I came, I moved to the flat that night. I remember it was very messy because before me there were 2 guys living in that room, and they smoked, they threw the trash, garbage everywhere. It smelled disgusting. So when I came, me and my roommate had to clean everything else and rearrange it to make it better." Tuan shared a room in Shadwell with a Vietnamese colleague from his work in a restaurant. Whilst he appreciated living close to work and saving money by sharing the rent, he did not spend a great deal of time at the flat and noted the challenges of shared living. He compared his current house to his home in Vietnam, describing the multiple activities taking place in one room and the absence of privacy in shared spaces. He says, "Because, we eat in the same room that we sleep, it's quite like home in Vietnam. We don't have a dining room, we don't have a whole bedroom, everything happens in one room. It means everybody faces each other, things like that, most of the time." Tuan's description of his accommodation highlights the ambivalence of home as a concept. He was already familiar with cohabitation and living in close proximity to others, from living with his family in crowded Ho Chi Minh City. His Shadwell house engendered feelings of continuity and perhaps helped him to make sense of his new environment. But it doesn't necessarily mean that to him it felt like a homely place. Most participants living in rented accommodation had not made substantial changes in terms of furnishing or decoration. Whilst this is partly due to the practical feasibility of redecorating, it should also be acknowledged that aesthetic forms of homemaking may not be considered a priority by migrants themselves. However, participants' narratives also highlighted ways that they created their own senses of home in relatively constrained spaces. One participant said, "I think previously we just had plain furniture and then we kind of made it more like a family household. Now we have all the stuff we need, like spices, ingredients, food, and then we customize it, like buying the throws to customize the sofa, bring more stuff in like the games. I think we customized it in a way that makes it feel like it's our house now." Despite the often transient nature of their housing, many participants are able to cultivate a sense of home whilst acknowledging the ambivalent, fragile nature of this concept. Ngok's description of customizing also speaks to the ways in which home is not located in a fixed place but can be understood as a fluid space, set of practices and emotions that's always in the process of becoming. In the next section, I consider the ways in which participants create ideas and feelings of home through objects, practices and social interactions. The section begins with an excerpt from my field notes that documented a home tour conducted with Son, who came to London as a refugee in 1979. In Son's kitchen, magnets and postcards collected from Vietnam and numerous locations, including Europe, Malaysia and Dubai, are displayed on the fridge freezer. On top of the fridge is an altar to the kitchen god, one of the Taoist deities that's worshipped in Vietnam. Altars to the Buddha, the goddess Guan Yin, and to Son's ancestors are displayed on top of the cabinets, framed with candles, incense, and artificial flowers. The altar to Son's parents contains their portraits on the wall, above offerings of fruit and cigarettes offered because Son's father smoked during his life. A small table houses family photographs, one of which has been enlarged from a small black and white photograph that was carried on the boat from Vietnam. Upstairs, Son pointed out a cabinet that looks as if it could be from Asia, but was actually bought in the British store past times. Each wall of the bedroom contains shelving from floor to ceiling, housing a variety of objects within Son's various collections, including from Lord of the Rings and Asian martial arts. Son shows me a painting of a monkey that reflected his year of birth in the lunar calendar. Shelves above his desk display pictures of Vietnamese landscapes, photographs of his graduation and primary school class from Scotland, which was where he was first sent when he came as a refugee, as well as lots of fiction and non-fiction books. Son commented that visitors described his home as busy with too much stuff. Son explained, "I like things around me, they're memories, they remind me of stuff, you know." Son's objects represent his enjoyment of travel and remind him of the places he's visited, including the home in Vietnam that he has lived away from for most of his life. Son's possessions are also points of connection with family members and friends, some of whom are overseas or have passed away. Son noted that his objects have been collected from around the world and was especially keen to point out objects that were brought back home in Vietnam, including pictures of rural Vietnam, such as village scenes and rice fields. The pictures portray a romantic vision of the Vietnamese countryside and evoke a longing for the original homeland that is part of Vietnamese cultural identity. Son's possessions can be seen as multisensory, spatial and temporal expressions of history and identity, as well as perhaps making sense of the loss of his childhood home. Son's attachment to and care for his collections can also be understood in terms of an act of preservation, a tangible way of keeping his past alive in the present. And that's described in work by Hecht, who looks at how a childhood home can almost be preserved, as if it was in a museum. However, contemporary approaches to home and mobility suggest that domestic possessions are not only a bridge to the past, but connect with the present and the future. Brickell proposes migrants' home spaces as sites of emplaced mobility, in which, I quote, "people reorient themselves not only to their new homes, but also to their old homes and memories." Viewing the home as a translocal space highlights the ways in which ideas and practices of home not only relate to creating a sense of continuity with the past, but also become part of an imagined future. Though Son currently lives alone, he talks often about his plans to bring his wife and daughter over from Vietnam when he is earning enough to meet the current immigration requirements. In addition to creating a sense of home through continuity with the past, therefore, I would argue that Son is constantly reshaping his home as part of his desired future. Examining participants' chosen objects reveal the complex layers of meaning that can be associated with these artifacts and images. T described his Buddhist amulet as a form of spiritual protection that he had carried with him on his journey from Vietnam. However, he also associated the amulet with his mother, family, and home. Father Simon, who works at a local Vietnamese Catholic church, pointed out embroidered pictures of Vietnamese rural landscapes that he'd brought back from visits to the country, describing how he displayed them in the rectory in London to make guests and visitors feel a sense of home. These discussions emphasise the multiple sensory, emotional and imaginative dimensions of objects and images, but also reveal how they can undergo transitions and even transformations in the context of mobility. My research has also revealed the ways in which everyday homemaking practices are influenced by the sending and receiving of objects between Vietnam and the UK. Several participants had been sent objects related to food preparation and cooking, items of furniture and home decoration, usually obtained from a relative or friend who was visiting the UK, but sometimes through international delivery. Participants had also asked their relatives to send or bring medicines, cosmetics, food, clothes and stationery. Ngoc's mother had been closely involved in furnishing and decorating the flat that she lived in with other Vietnamese students. She pointed out items in her bedroom that had been brought and sent from Vietnam by her mother, including a rug and curtains. She says, "Oh yes, this rug, it wasn't my idea, but my mum was like, because of the previous people who were living here, she'd actually get down on the floor and scrub the carpet twice with a detergent, but she still felt like you're not walking there barefoot, so she sent me a rug from Vietnam. And she said just to lay it down here in case your blanket or pillow falls down so you can walk bare feet inside. Just don't walk bare feet in the grey carpeted area." And I was just like, okay, but I never do it. I leave it out for her though. The previous curtains were really thin and I think she didn't like them either. So basically she measured the dimensions of the window and the length she wanted, and then she actually went back to Vietnam and had it custom made. And this explanation highlights the influence of Ngoc's mother's views on her home and homemaking practices, realised through the sending and transporting of items from Vietnam. While finance is obviously sometimes a major factor in these decisions, Vietnamese objects were often seen as more attractively designed and sometimes of superior quality to those available in the UK. Ngoc's narrative also speaks to the ways in which her mother is able to maintain her parental role and to remain involved in her daughter's home life despite the distance between them. My research has revealed the ways in which religious objects become associated with home in multiple ways, particularly in the context of migration. Participants shared a range of objects that they use as part of their domestic religious practice, including photographs of their ancestors, particular items of food and drink, candles, incense, and figures of the Buddha and other deities. Participants in shared or temporary housing may be unable to house an altar due to spatial or financial constraints. The presence or absence of an altar is also related to participants' motivations to migrate and where they perceive home to be. Some participants did not feel that it was their role to house an altar because their parents maintained responsibility for honouring the ancestors in the family home in Vietnam. However, people often drew upon other objects that enabled them to maintain their religious practices in different ways. This image is a photograph of the mantelpiece in Ngoc's living room, on which are displayed objects including a large incense burner, lotus-shaped candles, artificial flowers, and offerings of water in small porcelain cups. This shrine resembles a traditional altar, but is focused on a depiction of the Buddha and does not venerate any ancestors. It does not include any pictures or shelves that are fixed to the wall, making it practical for living in rented housing. Ngoc explained that as part of the process of establishing her home in London, she also consulted her mother for advice on the practicalities and demands of worship in her new location. She said, "Well, basically, when I was asking her, do we need that? As in, do we need to have a picture of my grandfather or something? And she said, that's too complicated for you. So instead, you can have a picture of the Buddha. It's a good blessing for the house." Participants adapt their practices to the opportunities and barriers in their new environment, leading to a reconfiguration in practices of worship over transnational space and time. Min described the differences between her practice of worship in London and Vietnam. She says, "In Vietnam we have a room for ancestors only, but here the house is so small, so we don't have the space. So we have the statue of the Buddha instead. The statue should be placed stably, you should not move it. Even after we burn the incense many times and there's some dust around it, you just clean it but don't move anything. If you move it, maybe your business isn't good, your house isn't good, something like that. But here it's so different because we don't have the space." During worship, people ask their ancestors to ensure good health for themselves and their families, as well as asking for assistance with practical matters such as exams, relationships, journeys, and financial difficulties. Min described a sequence of worship in her narrative. She said, "Yeah, we say prayers for Vietnam and the UK because I live here as well. And then I will pray for my family, like my parents will be healthy, and if they've been sick, that they will get well. I wish I can have a merit at college. I wish I can pass my exams," something like that. So you go from general to detail. This quotation highlights that practices of ancestor worship are not only intertwined with the home and family, but also link the Vietnamese home with the wider world. Min asks the spirits to bless Vietnam as a nation, not only because it's where her family is located, underlining the associations between ancestor worship, religion and national identity, which are very important in Vietnam. Min also includes her current location in her prayers, connecting her present home in London with her family home and ideas of home and identity on a national scale. Spiritual practices are also connected to work and business. T, who works in a Vietnamese restaurant, describes how he lights incense and makes offerings to the god of fortune on an altar in his workplace. The gods of earth and fortune are believed to protect and bring prosperity to the business, and altars are commonly found within Vietnamese restaurants, shops and nail salons in London. Relationships between transnational migration and religion reveal the ways in which movement and travel are not only practiced by worshippers, but can be seen as part of the essence of spirits themselves. The portability of many religious objects and practices enables worshippers who migrate to maintain a sense of continuity and to feel a sense of belonging as part of transnational religious networks. However, the consequences of migration for religious practice can be complex and unsettling. One participant told me that he and his colleagues didn't know whether they should worship in English or Vietnamese, and whether the spirits could hear them in their new location. These have got a bit out of order, but that's an altar in a Vietnamese restaurant near to the Jeffrey Museum. Whilst objects and practices are a significant aspect of creating a sense of home among many participants, other narratives illustrate the ways in which concepts of home stretch beyond the boundaries of the house. For Hien, the location of her flat on the River Thames was a significant part of why she chose to live in the apartment and was an ever-present reminder of the city. She said, "I think I like the fact that we have this window looking out to the river. To me, it's an expanded part of the flat. We don't feel that we can only be here. We can always walk out there. That's why I like this flat." Hien's narrative speaks to a sense of freedom and space in being able to access the river and spend time outside rather than feeling confined within the relatively small space of her flat. The close proximity of the river made Hien feel that this environment was also part of her home in London and an important aspect of her experience of living in the city. And this is a view from a participant's flat in Mile End, and she really liked the fact that she could see those really famous buildings in the city and business district. This paper has revealed the multi-scalar connections between the Vietnamese home, city and worlds beyond, and the ways in which participants' senses of home are adapted and sometimes transformed in the process of mobility. My research highlights the significance of tangible and intangible aspects of home for participants, whose senses of belonging are found in a diverse assemblage of objects and practices. While for some individuals, home is still clearly rooted in Vietnam or inseparable from notions of family, others articulate the possibility of feeling at home in more than one place. However, throughout my thesis, I argue that migrants' abilities to develop a sense of home are impacted upon by external conditions. Challenges to remaking home are particularly acute in London, in which long-term housing security is currently unachievable for most of my participants. The shifting demands of immigration policy also shape individuals' access to home, work and mobility. I argue that the capacity to establish a sense of belonging, however fluid or mobile, is also contingent upon wider relations of power. And that's it. Thank you very much.